Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. The vote to certify President-elect Joe Biden was historic for all the wrong reasons.
What unfolded today is not peaceful protest. This is domestic terrorism.
A politically charged mob, egged on by the president himself, brings democracy to a halt. In a minute, University of Washington historian Margaret O'Mara will help us sort it all out. First, let's get you caught up on how it played out for Washington's Congress members.
I could see Capitol Police with their guns drawn, barricades in front of the main door to the chamber, ready to take on anybody that came through the door.
That's Seattle Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal telling KUOW about the moment she had to take cover in the House gallery as pro-Trump insurrectionists overtook the U.S. Capitol yesterday, cutting short a joint session of Congress to certify President-elect Biden's victory. Vancouver Republican Jamie Herrera Butler was there, too.
I mean, they barricaded the doors with historic furniture. I never thought I'd see this day when I really felt like we were under siege.
The violence was shocking enough to change the mind of the only member of the state's delegation who planned to object to the vote count. Republican Cathy McMorris Rodgers of Spokane called it disgraceful and un-American and said the president should, quote, put an end to this madness. That hasn't happened, though, and now some are asking if the country can make it to Inauguration Day. As of last night, at least 4 Washington state Democrats had called on Vice President Mike Pence to use the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump from office for inciting an attack on the peaceful transfer of power. And it wasn't just D.C. State troopers had to clear a group of armed demonstrators who stormed the gates of the governor's mansion in Olympia with Governor Inslee inside. Inslee denounced what he called acts of sedition and intimidation and called for more Republicans to speak up against them. His November opponent, former Republican Police Chief Lauren Culp, was quiet Wednesday and still hasn't conceded despite losing by 500,000 votes.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them.
That was President Trump speaking to his supporters in Washington, D.C. yesterday. He also repeated his false claim that he won the November election. After the speech, hundreds of pro-Trump extremists stormed the Capitol building, interrupting the certification of Joe Biden's win. Congresspeople and their aides were evacuated, forced to shelter in place for hours. It was a stunning day after months of political division over the election results. We're so lucky. Margaret O'Mara is here to help us get some perspective on the events. She's a history professor at the University of Washington. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. So the language is really important here. This started as a protest, but it ended up as something very different. What word or words best describe what happened at the Capitol?
Oh, gosh. Making history, but reflecting history.
You think so?
I think so. Departing from every norm, we don't have precedent for so many things that have happened, particularly in the last couple of months. We have never had a president who's refused to concede. We've never had a president who's actively called the election a fraud continually, and culminating in yesterday morning with the rally on, before these supporters, riling them up, and then they turn and go to the Capitol and this happens. But at the same time, we have had, protests that have occupied public buildings, not just in the last year, but going further back. We have had cries of socialism and communism taking over the United States, people waving the flag and saying they're defenders of democracy, but using violent means to do that.
The people who stormed the Capitol today would call themselves patriots.
That's right. And they're operating of information that is different from from reality, that is divorced from reality.
And how do we reconcile that when we describe what's happening? Because it's a false narrative that they're adhering to. It's not true. Is this a failed coup? Are these insurrectionists? How should we be describing what happened?
I think insurrectionist is a good nomenclature. I think certainly the decision by many media organizations not to go beyond calling them protesters. Protesters are, this was not a peaceful protest. And this also was kind of the argument that they're advancing is one that's denying the constitutional reality and the constitutional processes, ones that leaders of both parties were trying to uphold in the counting of the electoral votes, which is usually, to be clear, the most boring and this is a very ceremonial, procedural thing. But yet it is, every moment has been fraught. And, this is all intersecting with something that in 1824 and 1826 Americans didn't have to deal with, which is this social media environment, which is, we've always had communications media kind of playing into people's perceptions. It isn't as though fake news is a new thing. Like, let me show you the 18th century if you'd like to see some fake news. But this sort of disinformation and the ability to kind of go into a corner and just get, channels fed to you that are giving you a small sliver of information that's actually not anchored in reality. But when it's also being sanctioned by someone who is the sitting president of the United States, that makes it much harder to push back on.
Yeah. Twitter deleted 2 of the president's tweets yesterday, locked his account. Some people might say a little late. Mm-hmm. Twitter also said it would permanently ban him if he didn't stop violating the policies. Can you shut the president down if you take him off Twitter?
No, he'll find other ways. And there are already other avenues, right? So Twitter and Facebook have cracked down on some of the most extreme voices. And those voices have migrated to new social media networks of their own. And that's really a whole nother online world. And I think there's an interesting, one thing that historians are pointing to as a historical parallel, which I think is admittedly quite alarming one, but I think it's worth considering, is the South after the Confederacy. So the South loses the Civil War. After the Civil War, Robert E. Lee tells his constituents, okay, it's time, it's over. We've lost. We need to retire with honor and go about our business. But even though Lee himself was not egging on the troops, so to speak, the lost cause mythology of what the Civil War was supposedly about, which it was not about, sort of reframing the Civil War as this great tragedy of the South, as it was a fight for states' rights and constitutional rights. And it was an elaborate myth-making perpetuated by white Southerners as a way to perpetuate white supremacy. And it was incredibly effective. It produced, blockbuster movies and books and history textbooks for generations, and we're still trying to undo it.
How do you think history will look back on this day? What's the story of Biden's vote certification?
Look, I already kind of knew that. So I'm a co-author on a history textbook. And you know how your textbooks have sections? And there's like 1945 to 1980 and, kind of like landmark years that are turning points where we kind of bookend one historical era, begin another. I was already like 2020 is where section 10 ends of the textbook. Like that's, and then we're bringing a new section. And so now we got a perfect opener, January 6, 2021, Insurrection Day. This is not something we're going to forget in 2 months or 2 years. This is a big deal. And that it has a shadow, too. What's going to happen after? And I think that's the big question mark. What's going to be the longer shadow of this era in American politics? It's not going to go away. Things that drove people to the Capitol were not impulses that were born with Donald Trump. It sort of picked up on some pretty nasty impulses that have always been around. But this extremism that played out, I think ultimately, if I were a Republican senator or member of the House, I'd be very worried about how that delegitimizes my party and the principles and the policies that it's trying to advance. This has had consequences. And if anything, I think this is going to put further fire under certainly those who are coming into power to really make significant change in a lot of different ways.
Margaret O'Mara is a history professor at the University of Washington. Thank you so much.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.